Now, in this video, we're going to shift away from the false judgment and the analysis of false judgments and all that stuff. Socrates has said, okay, I'm done. Theaetetus is thoroughly confused. And they put that to the side, right? It seemed like it was a big, important thing, and arguably it was, but not necessary that that be clarified in order to come up with, again, an answer to our main question. And our main question is, what is knowledge? What's episteme? And we've seen a few attempts at it, and they've failed. So where are we now? Well, Socrates then says, maybe there's something, as he says, in a kind of metaphorical sense. The argument way back at the beginning was telling us something, and we should have listened a little bit more closely. And you could think of this as kind of listening to your intuitions a bit. But what Socrates goes on to say is, we made a bit of an error here. And this has been raised kind of partially or obliquely throughout the dialogue. And that is that we made a mistake. That is figuring out what Q's properties are before understanding Q itself. That's a problem. You shouldn't do that, right? And Socrates is always, in various dialogues, when people will say, well, what about a certain, can virtue be taught? And he'll say, well, before I give you, a property of virtue, that is its teachability or non-teachability, we should, again, it's a dialogue, so it's a group endeavor. We should figure out what virtue is. So it's a mistake to try and figure out the properties of virtue, like whether it can be taught, before really understanding what virtue itself is. And Socrates says, we've been guilty, my dear Theaetetus, of trying to figure out some properties before, namely, false judgments and things like that about knowledge, before really figuring out what knowledge is. So let's put all that aside. However, remember, he has said many times, we at least presuppose the possibility that we would recognize a correct definition of knowledge, even though we don't really know what knowledge is. So there's all kinds of issues swirling around here. But Socrates says, let's get back to our main point again in the whole Theaetetus, and that is, what is episteme? What is knowledge? So what have we had? Just a quick recap. So far, we had our first definition. Remember, way at the beginning, that was the series of examples. Didn't work. Remember, Socrates gives a number of criticisms about the series of examples, so back and refresh your memory about that. Then the second one was knowledge is perception, aesthesis, remember? So we got a few notions of what knowledge has to have, namely knowledge is correct, it has to have that kind of conviction, there's an immediate sense to it. That's kind of like aesthesis, kind of like the senses. But then the senses, we looked at variety of arguments. They led off into that Protagorean crazy world of flux and all that. And you had problems with meaning. You had all kinds of problems. And of course, remember that aesthesis and the senses, they may not give you error, but they don't give you truth either. So there was that non-cognitive problem. And truth is definitely something we're going to say is cognitive. Knowledge knowledge that is something that has to be predicated on something that's cognitive, gives us true, false, etc., etc. So that boosted knowledge out, shall we say, metaphorically speaking, out of this sort of level of aesthesis and perception into something that the soul is doing when it considers what's outside, but it's considering it within itself. Remember that nice little aside, or that nice little digression on thinking being the soul talking to itself. So knowledge is boosted into the realm of thought. And then off to the races with regards to, well, how can we have false beliefs and false thoughts, etc., etc. Okay, so then in comes Theaetetus to say, all right, enough, we'll go with a third definition, that knowledge is true belief, right? Forget all that false stuff. Let's just go with knowledge is true belief. And Socrates says, all right, that's great. We have another one, and it's not going to work. right away. And he makes shorter shrift of this, shall we say. But I do want to have a little bit of discussion, namely, I'm breaking up into two parts. So this is part one, where I'm going to talk about knowledge as true belief. It's the jury discussion. So there's some interesting stuff going on here. And I want to give you a few reflections on the jury discussion. So we're really only around 200. It's not very long, but there's a lot of stuff going on in here, and at least a lot for us to think about what we would like to examine and reflect upon when we're considering our main question: what is epistemic? So Socrates, so right away, not going to work. And he makes a little joke, and he says, how do we know this? Well, we're going to look at the greatest representatives of wisdom, namely orators and lawyers. And we've already seen Socrates take a little shot, a little jibe at lawyers. And of course, Socrates is getting ready to meet the lawyers because his trial is coming up. So, this is all when things are not going well for Socrates. And as we know, it ended pretty badly. But he says that if we look at orators and lawyers, we will get some argument to show that knowledge cannot be true belief. All right, so that's our main point here. Now, what do lawyers do? What is the art of lawyers and orators? What's their goal? Well, people say that, it's to get to the truth or whatever. Yeah, but it's to get to what's often called legal truth, right? And legal truth is a different notion than just plain and simple truth, because in legal truth, you're only looking at the incident in question, whatever that may be, on the basis of what's presented in court. And of course, as we know, that what's presented in court is what is admissible in court. So there's all kinds of rules to think about when you're involved in a court case. So how you make your decisions is going to be based on the materials that are allowed into the court. Now, in addition to materials being allowed into court, you don't have all day in court. And in the Greek era, when they had their courts, basically they had a water clock. So they would fill a jug up that had a hole in the bottom. They would fill it up with water, and then pull out the stopper, and you got to speak as a lawyer or whatever, as a defendant or whatever you were doing, but they would pull that out and you got to speak until that vessel had drained itself of water. So it was measured by the clock, the water clock. So there are restrictions, but Socrates thinks that the story of these restrictions will help us to understand why this is the case. In other words, knowledge is not true belief. Okay, so the art of lawyers is to produce conviction in others. Is it really to get the truth? Well, your lawyer is really out to produce a conviction in the jury that you're innocent. Is it really always about truth? Well, that's a debatable point. But it is the art of producing conviction in others, and of course, that's what orators are trying to do within a certain time span. What's a great orator? Is someone who could convince you of something very quickly, right? All right, so and on this note, Socrates goes and offers some distinctions. And what he says is that you're trying to produce a belief in a short period of time. And what Socrates says is that that's not, like, persuading somebody is not really teaching them. So he introduces a distinction, that is, of teaching versus persuading. And teaching is something, shall we say, it's a deeper notion of truth. Teaching someone truth is a deeper notion than persuading. So in this distinction here, the court only operates at this level, but he thinks, to jump ahead a little bit, that this is really where knowledge operates. Teaching is the basis of knowledge, not simple persuasion. And the courts, again, are stuck with this one of persuading. Why? Because they have time limits. And notice in this dialogue, we frequently talk about or Socrates does, excuse me. Socrates frequently talks about the philosopher being the person of leisure, right? And that's how you really get to learn about things, is in a leisurely way. You have time to let the idea, shall we say, soak in. You have time to manipulate the idea, look at it from all angles, see how it applies, see how it doesn't. So this notion of really learning or teaching or thinking on a real wavelength, which is going to be these kinds of properties that are ultimately bound up with knowledge, they cannot be, shall we say, limited by the water clock. That which is limited by the water clock, that's things like persuasion and not teaching. So think about something Socrates says, in this sense, like a robbery, right? And the jury is trying to figure something out about what happened during a robbery, but they weren't there. So Socrates says what you're really going to get is a jury trying to figure out something about which they were not an eyewitness, and maybe there were no eyewitnesses as well. So Socrates says, I'm going to follow him roughly, like suppose that Z is some kind of event that can only be known by being an eyewitness to it. And he says, let's presuppose that in the court there is sort of a just persuasion of Z. So the jury has been justly persuaded of Z, and what he's trying to do is peel the notion of just persuasion and peel it away from us just immediately conflating it with knowledge, that just persuasion is not the same thing as knowledge. So, and that's exactly what he says, is that even if you were justly persuaded of something in a court, it's still the case, that is, as a jury, it's still the case that you don't really know it. Why is that? Well, is it because of a lack of time, or is it the jury's belief is secondhand? What's really going on? There seems to be, again, a clash here, because if you say it's just a lack of time, it would be, well, if we just abolish the water clock and maybe allow juries to have more time and lawyers to have more time, you could have knowledge in courtrooms rather than mere persuasion. You could really have teaching because it's just a matter of time. And Socrates says, well, that's probably doubtful. Or is it just simply the case that the jury's belief is secondhand, and no matter what, no matter how much time you have, you still are never going to get knowledge? Now, this conflict is not absolutely necessary to resolve. The main point here is that what Socrates is trying to do is to say that you could be justly persuaded of something, you could be justified in believing something, but that still is not going to make it knowledge. So now we've introduced a notion of justification, so things get even a little bit more complex, but it's not absolutely necessary to resolve all these problems. The main takeaway point is that Socrates is wanting to say that this might be part of the answer to the problem of what is knowledge, but it's not going to be a sufficient answer to this. Now, what I'd like to do is to reflect just a little bit more, to make a few more points about this, as to this distinction of knowledge, this distinction within the concept of knowledge, thought broadly, between teaching and persuading, and to go into a little bit more detail of A and B. But I'll do that in the next video. Stay tuned.